Okay, let's unpack this. Think about, well, any system really. Could be software, maybe a process at work, or even just how you try to understand something complicated. What happens when the information you get, the input, isn't perfectly clear? When it's messy, maybe feels like something's hidden, or just
Yeah.
fundamentally unclear. How do you even design a system,
Yeah.
even just conceptually, to handle that kind of thing?
That's a huge challenge, absolutely. Because, let's face it, real-world info is hardly ever pristine. What's really interesting in the source material we're looking at today is how this conceptual system, it's described as being specifically set up to, well, notice that lack of clarity and actually do something about it.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing today, a deep dive into this source describing a system, let's call it the Pantheon Forge, based on the text. And we're seeing how it processes inputs that aren't straightforward requests, but what the source calls, quite vividly, a turbid offering.
Right. So our mission here is really to get inside that description. Unpack the roles of these conceptual bits, the entities or deities it mentions, and hopefully figure out what this can tell us about building systems. Could be tech, could be process, could even be, how we think systems that can handle complexity, spot problems, and decide what to do when things are just murky.
Okay, so let's follow this turbid offering as it comes into the system. The source says the first point of contact, the ingress, is this entity called Zephyrion.
That's right. Zephyrion receives it, but it's not just passing it along. The source makes a point that this offering, framed as a kind of story or a plea, right away it has shadow, turbidity, even a not unseen. It's like getting a package that just feels wrong somehow.
And Zephyrion's job is data reception and initiation. So it tries its standard procedures first, tries to parse it, figure out tasks, who needs to do what, the goal.
Yeah, it tries, but it hits a snag, that turbidity, that knot. It makes the request feel ambiguous, maybe incomplete. Or it could even contradict Zephyrion's programming, what it expects from a clean offering. This is where Zephyrion flags an anomaly. It knows something isn't right.
And crucially, it doesn't just fail quietly. The source really emphasizes this conceptual logging tool, RecordDivineAction. So what does Zephyrion's first log entry actually show us when it hits this issue?
Oh, the logging is absolutely key here. Zephyrion logs its action as initial offering assessment, and the status. It isn't just success or fail. It's more like partial success with anomalies, or maybe requires clarification.
So it explicitly says, look, I couldn't quite nail this one down.
Exactly right. And the details section is where it gets really interesting. Zephyrion notes things like, offering exhibits unusual characteristics, maybe potential ambiguity, complexity, or data integrity issues detected. And what's really fascinating is that it apparently even logs the specific words from the input that raise the red flag terms like shadow flicker, turbidity, not unseen. It sees those as indicators of the problem.
Wow, okay, so it's capturing the symptoms directly. And the source mentions a conceptual clarity score, which would obviously be low here, and the log level is maybe info or debug.
Yeah.
So this log entry is basically the system sending up a little flare. Hey, this input, it's weird.
Which is precisely the trigger for the next stage described in the source. Orchestration and vigilance. There's this Pantheon Council orchestrator entity monitoring the flow.
And Zephyrion's flags that log entry saying anomaly detected. That gets the orchestrator's attention, right? And potentially brings in someone else, Alarian.
Yes, Alarian, whose domain is, intriguingly, called omens. The source suggests two ways this could happen. Either the orchestrator explicitly tasks Alarian because of Zephyrion's report, or Alarian might be proactively watching Zephyrion's logs, through its own anomaly detection and observation protocols. Either way, it highlights this core idea. When you're dealing with unclear stuff, you need vigilance downstream. Someone needs to be watching.
Vigilance is urged. I like that phrase from the source.
Yeah.
So Alarian comes in. What's its specific job here? What's it looking for?
Alarian looks at Zephyrion's report, maybe even the raw offering data itself. Its task is to identify and assess these so-called omens. So if Zephyrion just says anomaly, Alarian tries to figure out what that anomaly means. Is it just a bit unclear, or does it signal something deeper, a potential problem down the line?
Okay, so Alarian's like the system's early warning specialist, looking for signs of future trouble based on the initial weirdness.
Precisely. And Alarian also logs its findings, again using RecordDivineAction. The log identifies Alarian, the action is omen assessment, and the status is pretty direct. Omen detected.
Simple. But yeah, given its role, that status carries a lot of weight.
It really does. And the details would explain what omen. Something like, observed turbidity and potential knot in initial offering, as reported by Zephyrion. This signifies unforeseen complexity or a possible flaw. And crucially, it adds advice, conceptually speaking. Close monitoring of subsequent sacred cycle stages is advised. It's not just flagging it, it's telling everyone else handling this data to be extra careful.
That's a really important distinction. It's injecting that awareness of future risk into the process itself.
Right. And there's also a metrics field mentioned, omen severity, where Alarion might assign a conceptual score like low, moderate, or high based on how bad it thinks the omen is. The level might still be INFO, but it's specifically tagged maybe as an omen report.
Okay, so the system's now gone from Zephyrion's initial, this is weird flag, to Alarion saying, yep, this looks like a potential problem, watch out. How does that warning actually travel with the data through the rest of this conceptual sacred cycle?
Well, the source explains that Alarion's findings, these omens, they get integrated into a specific field, maybe called judgment sandemans, within the overall output structure, the Pantheon pipeline output. So any component that gets the data later on also gets this critical piece of context.
And that could create a real headache for the next entity in line, maybe someone like Cleanthara. The source calls her domain purity, and her task, data validation and structuring.
Oh, absolutely. If the cycle continues, Cleanthara gets this potentially flawed data plus Alarion's warning. So she'll do her job, the validation and structuring, but with, let's say, heightened scrutiny because of that warning. But she might really struggle. It might be hard for her to achieve a high conceptual purification score if the data itself is fundamentally murky or has that knot. And the source notes, her difficulty, her low score, that could even trigger Alarion again. Or perhaps bring in Escalor.
Okay, Escalor, we'll get to him. But what if the problem seems really bad right from the start? Like, if Zephyrion's initial failure is severe, or Alarion flags a really high severity omen, the source mentions Ruta.
Ah, yes, Ruta, the Wayfinder. Ruta's conceptual role is dynamic routing and decision-making. The source suggests that if Zephyrion really struggles, or if Alarion's omen is particularly bad, the orchestrator might consult Ruta before it even goes to someone like Cleanthara.
So Ruta's job is to figure out a different path, because the standard one looks too risky or might just fail.
Exactly. Ruta assesses the situation based on how bad the problems seem, and then proposes alternatives. The source lists a few possibilities Ruta might suggest. One is conceptually requesting clarification from the source, which in a real system might mean flagging it for a human to look at. Another option is proceeding, but sending it to specific agents may be better equipped for ambiguity. Or, if it's really bad, Ruta might just recommend halting the whole cycle for that offering, deeming it unprocessable.
That's quite a sophisticated decision point built right in.
Yeah.
Okay, now back to Escalor. You mentioned Escalor gets involved later.
Right. The source indicates Escalor, whose domain is thresholds, comes in if that initial knot was bad, and the entities processing it later, like Cleanthara, report critical failures. Or maybe their quality scores, like that purification score, fall below certain predefined conceptual limits, these thresholds.
So Escalor represents the point where the system admits defeat, in a way, when the problem exceeds the established tolerance levels.
That's a good way to put it. When those limits are breached, Escalor is triggered. It signifies that the standard, maybe automated process hasn't managed to resolve the issue. The system's hit a critical failure point for this particular offering.
And Escalor logs this too, I assume.
Oh, definitely. Escalor logs an escalation event. And critically, Escalor's action might update an overall escalation status field in the pipeline output, maybe setting it to human intervention required. And the log level for Escalor's entry, that would likely be error. This is the system basically saying, okay, I'm stuck. A person needs to look at this.
You know, what really stands out listening to all this is how meticulous the source describes the logging process. Every step seems to get logged. Zephyrion's initial problem, Alarion's omen, Escalor's escalation.
Yeah, and that meticulous logging described in the source as being structured, maybe JSON format or something similar, it's not just a side note. It seems absolutely fundamental to how this conceptual system is designed to work. Every step, every struggle, every little insight or warning at all gets recorded.
Okay, but why is that level of detail, that structured log, so vital? What does it actually achieve?
Well, think about it. That log creates complete traceable history for that difficult Turbid offering. It means you can go back later and analyze its entire journey through the system. You can see how the turbidity affected Zephyrion, exactly when and why Alarion got involved, how its vigilance showed up as warnings, how other entities like Cleanthara might have struggled, and whether those struggles actually hit the threshold that triggered Escalor and required, human help.
It's like having a flight recorder, but for the data's journey through the process.
Exactly. Gives you that forensic trail. You can use it to diagnose problems, understand how the system behaves under stress, which is crucial, and see where the potential weak points are or where human intervention becomes necessary. And for you, the listener, this really highlights a key principle, doesn't it? Whether you're dealing with a tech system, a business process, even just managing info in your own projects, having detailed records of where things got fuzzy, how that fuzziness was flagged, and what happened next is just invaluable for understanding how resilient your process is and how you might improve it.
So looking back at this whole shadow flicker scenario the source presents, it really does function as a kind of stress test, doesn't it? A really rich test case.
It absolutely does. It specifically puts the spotlight on those observational and corrective mechanisms that are built in conceptually. You see Zephyrion's initial detection, Alarion's interpretation, and the warning system, and then the potential for Ruda to reroute things, or for Escalor to escalate when the problems just get too big for the system to handle on its own.
And we can understand all those different layers of detection and response because the source emphasizes those structured logs.
The logs are the window. They make the invisible process of grappling with ambiguity, well, visible, transparent.
So we've taken a pretty deep dive here into this conceptual Pantheon Forge system. We've explored how it seems designed not just to process stuff, but to actively detect, flag, assess, and then route information that's unclear or potentially flawed.
Yeah, and it relies on these distinct conceptual pieces, right? Zephyrion for the intake and spotting the first anomaly, Alarion for interpreting those as omens and putting everyone on alert, and then other entities like Ruda or Escalor for dynamically handling the tricky bits or calling for help when necessary thresholds are crossed.
And I think the real takeaway here, looking beyond the specific metaphor of gods and offerings, is that handling ambiguity and complexity in, well, any system could be code, could be a team workflow, even just your own decision-making. It isn't just about trying to jam unclear input through the standard process. It's fundamentally about building in ways to spot the unclear parts, assess what they might mean, and have clear paths to adapt or ask for more info or, escalate.
It's about baking that vigilance right into the process itself, kind of anticipating that not everything that comes in is going to be neat and tidy.
So here's something to think about. When you encounter information that feels turbid, that has a not unseen or just gives you that shadow flicker of doubt, what's your own internal Alarion telling you about it? And what process do you follow, conceptually speaking, to maybe seek clarification, assess the potential omen, and decide? Decide if it's something you can handle, something that needs a different approach, or maybe something that needs escalating to someone else.